Hey there, welcome to Head, Heart, and Hustle, the podcast for creatives. As always, I'm your host, Alan Plummer. Thank you for listening. I certainly appreciate it. Now, anyone with a side hustle or creative outlet can feel isolated from their friends, their family, and others around them who just don't get their passion. That's why Head, Heart, and Hustle exists, to help you feel motivated, learn, and just get a nice pick-me-up of creative energy from other people like yourself. Every episode, I interview a creative individual who doesn't just pretend to be creative. They've rolled up their sleeves and are producing great things because they need to. They know that being creative is part of who they are. Sound familiar? Awesome, then you're in the right place. Now today, I'm with Dr. Andrea Letamendi. Drea, as she's known, is a clinical psychologist, scientist, and a convention speaker in Southern California. Now, if you've been listening to the podcast regularly, you know that last season I interviewed my good friend Brian Ward. Brian is a filmmaker and producer for the company Shout Factory in the Los Angeles area. Drea is actually his fiance and certainly a creative in her own right. She speaks on panels at comic conventions such as San Diego Comic-Con. She has run a blog about the psychology of superheroes, specifically Batman. She hosts 2 podcasts, including one very popular one that basically gets around the psychology behind Batman the Animated Series called the Arkham Sessions. By the way, I'll encourage you to check it out if you are a fan of Batman, specifically that animated series. And she just has done a wonderful job of melding her career around psychology with her love of comic books. Even though she doesn't fit the mold of a traditional creative, she was a wonderful interview for this podcast, and I really enjoy talking to her. So with that, let's dive in.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm well. I like to have everybody kind of start by introducing themselves. One of the things I think it's helpful is I feel like I know a little bit about you, but it's always good to hear people kind of talk about who they are and what they do on their end. So why don't we just start there?
Okay. Well, I would say that generally I identify as a mental health professional. I'm a psychologist. I have a license in clinical psychology, and my overall professional identity is really centered around that. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, I would say that I have a lot of different, dimensions to my professional identity, but it all kind of leads or ties back to that one main core professional identity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you've been pretty tapped into kind of the creative side of things outside of work, right? So you have not one, but I guess 2 podcasts that you do. Yeah. I didn't even get a chance to talk to Brian, your fiance, about the whole cosplay thing and kind of the work that you guys have going on there. Yeah. You've got the blog. I guess, did it really start with the blog? Because there's all these different things that you kind of have going on, right?
Yes. Yeah. So I'm a psychologist. I'm a public speaker. I'm also a podcaster, and I am involved in I would say the comics industry, the entertainment industry, media, and that intersection is really where I think my creativity gets to blossom and grow, and really, I get to exercise or flex those muscles, so to speak. And you're right. It really did start with writing. So when I was getting a PhD in psychology, I never really found myself to be creative. I felt that I was very analytical. I wanted to be a computer scientist. Mm-hmm. I was in college. I loved numbers. I loved formulas. And I was drawn to that side of I guess, my skills. And then I got into psychology, and I learned that psychological science is a different kind of formulaic thinking, that it's, of course, very analytical, but there are also ways that you can predict behavior. There are ways that you can do experimental work, research. And actually, the brain is one of the most complex mysteries or questions that we can learn more about. So before I went to graduate school, I really discovered that my passion was psychological science. And of course, that mm-hmm. led to getting a PhD in clinical psychology. Throughout that, I wanted to write about what I thought was more of my hobby, which was comic books and fictional narrative, and really, deconstructing fictional characters, mm-hmm. usually through comics, science fiction, fantasy, that sort of thing. And in graduate school, I was going to Comic-Con. I was really involved in the community and found that that was really what I guess what I felt how my identity was very strong, at least creatively. How I was going to intersect or dovetail those interests, I really didn't know at the time. And I honestly was kind of seeing them as very separate. So you mentioned a blog. So I started writing about fictional characters and I started to meet writers and I would consult with writers, and the aspects between psychology and fictional narrative and character development, especially around superhero comics, that started to evolve more as a hobby. And it just felt that, those were the things that I was drawn to, pun intended, but I didn't think of it as anything professional at the time. I thought, this is just fun. This is just, getting to exercise some of my geeky sides and to really, just do some things that I enjoyed. And I honestly felt that in the field that I was going into, in the discipline of experimental psychology, clinical psychology, applied research, all these things that I felt that I was being, I guess, groomed to do, there was really no space for comics. That just isn't something that naturally go together. And I didn't have any mentors or advisors who were saying, yeah, there are other paths you can take. You get your PhD and you do all these other things. In fact, they were very much grooming you to become a professor, to do research, to work at a university, to be prolific in your writing when it comes to the science, when it comes to mental health interventions, when it comes to assessment, all those sorts of things. And I was passionate about that. And I just felt that that was very separate than what I considered a hobby at the time.
Yeah, and it's funny, right? So my wife has a similar story. My wife has a similar PhD, and they really do groom you to kind of go that tenure track route. When you start to commit to that, it does definitely kind of groom you into that space.
Yeah.
I love kind of the aspect of starting the writing, because you use the term deconstructive, which I love. Because as a writer, it's kind of reverse engineering the process in a lot of ways. I think really good writers, when they start to story tell and start to world build, a lot of times it's not just sitting down with pen and paper. It's kind of crafting out the characters and motivations and backstories. And I had a conversation with a writer friend of mine not too long ago who's working on his first novel. And I talked to him a little bit about my process for character development, and even getting down to like song preferences and kind of imagining some of the motivational stuff, so that when you start to write what ends up in the actual finished product, you have some of those back elements to kind of pull in. And what I see in some of your writing and some of the stuff that you're doing is, again, kind of almost that reverse engineering of that, which I just think is fascinating, because as a writer, it feels very close to that ability that good writers have.
Right. Right. And what I found is that I was tuning into stories, whether in I guess television and film or through novels, through comics themselves. What I was drawn to was the development of a character, the different psychological dimensions, their origin story, their resiliency, what they're overcoming. And there's so much psychology in that. And I realized that what I was enjoying from really well-written comics was the sophistication of the psychological piece. And so it's exactly what you're saying in terms of how well the writer is giving us that story and telling that narrative. And what I started to do was to teach other people about those narratives by lifting out the psychology and really talking about the psychology of the characters and the individuals and their relationships through what initially started as a blog, and then through my relationships with other people, with professionals who had the talent. And so what I was doing was consulting with others. I was now I have the great I guess I would consider it a great benefit, a pleasure to be able to sit in writers' rooms and to be able to do it that way. In the beginning, I was just sort of offering up my expertise and lending that through phone calls and through meetings and through email. And it was very enjoyable, but I didn't see it as a profession, or I didn't really see it as something that was, I guess, the norm. I felt that it was a little bit of a side, what I would consider a side hustle. And it really grew over the years.
And I think it's funny how sometimes the best things kind of come out of that without, versus the intention of really creating something to be noticed or consumed. Just kind of when you have things that tend to evolve very organically, I think there's an authenticity to them. So that said, I think I love the podcast, right? It's called the Arkham Sessions. You focus on Batman. Treasure trove of things to cover there. And I guess we should say more specifically the animated series, the original one, right? Why Batman?
Great question.
And you're pausing.
Why not?
Why not? I know.
Why not? There's so much to say about Batman. So for me, my gateway into comics was Batman. And it was through the animated series in the early 90s. I was in elementary school. I would watch episode after episode. And, at the time, I didn't really understand what it was that I loved about it. In fact, other people around my age will say, yeah, it was kind of dark, and it was, a little bit boring even. And it just wasn't, it's not your Adam West 66 Batman.
Right.
May he rest in peace. One of the great Batmans.
Yes.
It was a very different Batman, but I didn't know that. I thought that was who Batman was, very brooding, dark, and a great detective. And that show really brought out his psychological talent, his ability to look at the details and the evidence and the clues in people's behavior and motivation, and be able to do what I just said, to deconstruct a person and understand their next step. Now he's a superhero, or he's a, his job is to protect other people and keep the city from harm. So he's not a psychologist, but I felt that he really, in his show, that show really showcased and brought a lot of dedication to his intellectual side and his detective side that I was really drawn to as a kid. And growing up, especially as I was going into psychology, I guess made a full circle back to Batman, and through an interesting conversation that actually was inspired by my appearance in a documentary where all I talked about was Batman the animated series. It's actually, I should plug it. It's a great documentary. It's Necessary Evil, Supervillains of DC Comics, and it was a full feature-length documentary by DC Comics and Warner Brothers. And the entirety of the documentary is wonderful writers and artists and psychologists talking about the villains of DC Comics throughout the years, their development, their identities, their motivations, all that stuff. So it was right in my wheelhouse. And all of my examples that ended up in the documentary came from Batman the Animated Series. So it seemed like a no-brainer. Hey, let's put this thing together. Let's get in front of microphones and record episodes where I get to talk more about these characters and spend more time with them and teach other people about psychological science through this 90s cartoon.
And it's resonated, to say the least, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So were you a creative kid?
No.
No?
It's so funny. I don't think I was. I never really considered myself creative. And I think everything is relative.
Yeah.
I had an older sister who by far I felt she was an artist. She was constantly drawing. She was constantly painting. She was sculpting. She was making dresses out of, she was so crafty.
Right.
And now what my sister does is she essentially makes costumes and works on shows you see on TV related to dance shows.
Okay.
So you think you can dance, Dancing with the Stars, American Idol, X Factor, all of the shows you can think of where you have contestants dancing and wearing these amazing costumes. She worked on those.
Got it.
So she and I, so I'm sort of the analytical one. And growing up, because I compared myself to her, she's my older sister. I never felt as creative. But looking back, I was doing some pretty creative things. I created comic books. I created characters. I would do something really weird where I would check out books from the library, uh, and then I would remake them. So I would create. This sounds very weird, but I would take like construction paper and paper, and then I would draw out the characters, and it was like I think that I was trying to create my version of that story through art and through narrative, and it was a very solitary uh, exercise, but I was very bookish and I thought that I was very nerdy, but it turns out that I was involved in a lot of creative things. I just didn't see myself as a creative person.
Yeah, because that's totally creativity. I mean, I have a 6-year-old son. He does the same thing, right? I mean, he's constantly creating characters and world building. And, literally the other day, he got up in the morning. He has a pair of like fleece pajama bottoms or pants with skulls on them. They're gray and skulls. And he's got a pair of underwear from a kid's store that's black and got skulls on them. And he puts the pants on, puts the underwear on outside of the pants, no shirt. He runs around the house and he says, "Daddy, I'm Skullman." And literally he's creating powers and running around. And this is like before we're getting ready for school. But he's also that kid who's drawing and creating worlds and naming characters and taking other things that he likes and doing his own version of those. Totally.
I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's very natural, I think. And I think it totally makes sense. Did you was that, so if your sister was more of the creative one and you gravitated more towards towards psychology and things of that nature, was it something that you kind of refound? Because we talked a little bit about the blogging and you talked a little bit about coming out of grad school and doing that, but that's not only blossom into doing a podcast, but it's 2 podcasts and the other things that you've tapped into. Does it feel like maybe you're making up for lost time? Or am I putting words into your mouth? I think that's a fair question.
Yeah, you're sounding very analytical.
I don't mean to.
No, I think that I will admit, while I was in graduate school, I did feel a lot of, you described it as well. I did feel a lot of pressure to conform to the expectations and to be very studious and to get good grades. And in graduate school, you spend a lot of your time studying and reading and, taking comps and writing, and it's very analytical. It depends on, of course, what PhD you're getting. But in this case, that was a lot of analytical work.
Right.
And it's very possible that because my energy was in that direction and because I was unsure about how all this other fun stuff, this stuff that I liked as a kid, the stuff that I was worried would be considered childish, the stuff that I wasn't quite sure how would fit in my adult life.
Right.
I wasn't necessarily tuning into that as much. And then after graduate school, I think you're right in the sense that I felt a freedom, a professional freedom, an individual, personal freedom. It's kind of like, I'm an adult now. I've got my degree. I have a job. Maybe I should just open up more to some of these other opportunities. And like I said, flex some of those creative muscles. Yeah. And I think that there was certainly a lot of self-blame and a lot of, I would even say, stigma around comics. It's interesting to talk about it now because we do see a lot of comic book stories and characters and celebration in the media. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't always like that. And I think you and I would probably remember times where it wasn't as commonplace. It wasn't as mainstream.
Yes.
So I would say that this was the feelings that I had around it were remnants of how I was treated in junior high and elementary school, where it was not very popular and I was made fun of, and I'm a girl. And so why do I like superheroes? There's a lot more stigma around that.
Right.
And I held on to, I probably didn't reconcile or resolve those issues and carried them with me through adulthood. And then as I started to explore that more, I needed to address some of that shame and some of those identity issues if I was going to integrate those passions and those very deep interests and those creative interests. I would need to reconcile how I felt about it and how other people would respond to it. And something very pivotal happened right toward the end of graduate school. I had been working with a writer who was putting together a story for DC Comics. The title was Batgirl. So many folks are familiar with Batgirl.
Right.
In 2011, I believe, there was a lot of change for DC Comics. They were essentially reviving a lot of stories and changing a bunch of things. And Gail Simone was the writer for Batgirl at the time and was writing this very, very essential story for Batgirl, who experienced a trauma. And we had kind of a casual relationship on Twitter, but she reached out for a professional consultation, and we worked together through, I would say, back channeling, like just kind of offline. We were talking, and she was asking questions about character development, and she had wonderful questions about realistic settings. So how would a character approach therapy? What would the therapy room look? Really practical questions, like what would be on the walls? What does the therapist wear? How does a therapist talk? And I realized, and some people really know this because they go to therapy or they are a therapist. And I think that there's still a large population or group of people that are unsure about that and maybe even a little fearful.
Right.
And so we went through some practical questions like that, as well as psychological questions about recovery and interventions for trauma, and a lot of wonderful sort of psychological development for this character that everybody knows. And so it's a character that isn't a new character, but she's overcoming this difficult event. And then the comic came out, and I had the impression that perhaps there would be some dialogue that I would recognize, or maybe even the setting would be something that I would be able to pick out as like, oh yeah, we talked about that kind of setting, or some, I don't know, something that would tell me, oh, that's from our consultation. But she went further, and she actually created a character, a psychologist, who was named after me and was drawn like me. And it was right there on the pages. And I mean, I squealed. I was just outside of my body. I had this like out of body experience of feeling so overjoyed. And that was, for me, that was kind of the moment where everything intersected and it all made sense. Here's really why I'm being creative.
Right.
I am allowing other people who are legitimately writing and using their creative professional skills. But my job is to inform. My job is to consult. My job is to facilitate other people telling creative stories in a way that reduces stigma, in a way that builds awareness about psychology, in a way that that really does something wonderful for my field. And that, beyond the personal meaning, that has a huge impact for the discipline.
Mm-hmm. And I love the way you articulate that. And I appreciate you bringing it up. That was actually on my list, was to ask you about how you became a character in a comic book, which is just awesome. Like, you can't get more kudos than that in that world.
It's canon.
Yeah, exactly. You're canon. That's
so amazing.
How many people can walk around in the United States and say that? Not very many. That's pretty awesome.
I don't know. Yeah, it's so meaningful. And like I said, I mean, it's hard for me to articulate how meaningful it is to me because of my childhood creativity and some of the things that were important to me as a kid and helped me form my identity. But also it was a huge validation for me to realize I went into a field that I cared about, and I was able to carve out a professional identity and a function that really makes sense for my analytic and creative sides. And even now, as I talk about it, you're really the first person to kind of give me this airspace to really kind of explore that as like, oh, that really allowed me to fully just explore and experience that creativity that I felt maybe was stunted before.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because one of the things I find in a lot of the folks that I interview for this podcast is kind of that increased awareness around creativity as they kind of grow and mature. And I also think there's something very liberating, and you touched on this earlier, around having that creative freedom once you're set in your career and your job. I think creativity takes on a whole new form and meaning when it's not tied to money or income. And that feels so different than the way we treat creativity as a society. Because if you're a creative child and you're a creative teenager, a lot of times that is framed in the world of commerce, right? If you're a singer, you kind of want to grow up and become a singer, or you want to be on Broadway, or you want to become an actor and be on television. There's always these external goals that are tied to that. And I think that, at least for me, and you kind of alluded to this, once you get to a certain point in your career, or you've separated that creative impulse or that side hustle from what you do day to day, it's extremely liberating because you have creative control and you do things on your own terms, and you're able to kind of carve that out for yourself and do the things that you want to do and not do the things that you don't want to do and make time for it, as you kind of see fit and juggle all that stuff.
Absolutely. And there are a couple things that come to mind within that context. For one, I was able to be accountable for that in a good way. And I think that I was always a little nervous, or maybe I had some hesitation about the intersection of comics and psychology, or, how could I talk about Batman and really transition that to psychological science? I can do that in my sleep. Like that, for me, that's really easy.
Right.
But I wonder, how does that translate? Or will people really understand, and will they accept that?
Mm-hmm.
And I had to come to a place of just kind of accountability and self-acceptance around that particular skill, and celebrating that, like, I don't know who else can do it.
Right.
And that's a very Batman-esque thought. Batman's, he has a lot of different interesting professional values. And one thing that he believes in is that no one else can do his job. He is the only one who can do his job. And that's why he nearly kills himself doing it. And so I do think that if you think this all the time and you're not able to creatively think of your other values, it can be overwhelming. But I do think that a lot of us have to think that way and realize no one else can really do this. And so I have the opportunity to do it, and I have the resources and skills to do it. And I also have created self-acceptance, and I have the accountability around it. So why not?
Yeah. And the self-acceptance is huge, because then it becomes less about the external recognition. And to your point, it's about like, what if I'm only, what if this only taps into 10 people versus 10,000, and you're okay with that, right. That's a really liberating thing. So, I also think that there's an element of creativity that is very, this is going to sound very Zen, but I also think we live in a society that is so consumer based, and I don't mean monetarily, but right, we're in the 21st century. We have, smartphones in our pockets that can do anything. We have Wi-Fi all over the place. We have laptops. We have speakers that speak back to us, whether you're using a Google Home or an Alexa or something like that. And we're going to have self-driving cars soon. I think we're evolving to such a point that we're over-consuming media and information to the point that I think there's, in my opinion, whether it's spiritual or whatever, there's this sense of balance that sometimes need to be restored. I know for me, if I'm not truly creating something, whether it's in writing or having conversations like this or doing something, I feel physically and mentally different. I feel constipated. I interviewed a musician a while back that talked about creative constipation, and he mentally feels different when he doesn't get that opportunity for that output every so often.
Right.
And I think there's an element of that too. I think it's about a sense of balance for a lot of people who really are passionate about the things that they do. Totally. And
for me, I would say that not being my authentic self was very damaging.
Yes.
And there's a lot of work in this, actually. If we're not, and this is, now I'm going to sound kind of then if we're not enacting our true personal and even professional values, if we're not being our authentic selves, it does take a toll on us. It does make us more depressed.
I like to ask people about how they juggle everything, because you do have a professional life. You do have to pay
Right.
the bills.
Right.
You and Brian are going to comic conventions. You've got your social life. You've got 2 podcasts. You're still writing. You have to make time to watch episodes and analyze them. You somehow find time to tweet and have a presence on social media. Do you just sleep 90 minutes a night, or what's the process there?
So it's interesting. I've found that the work that I'm doing outside of my day job, my so-called day job, which I love very much, but isn't as creative as some of the things you just mentioned.
Sure.
The work that I'm doing outside of the day job actually energizes me and really aligns me with those principal professional values that that I think are really important. And so while it sounds kind of exhausting, it can really work, and it can actually really give us more energy if we're doing things that may not necessarily bring in revenue, but I would say give us fuel, give us the motivation, give us the validation. That's really important. I mean, we can't really monetize that, but it gives us the feeling of fulfillment and really, really feeds our professional values. And so when you talk about podcasting, when you talk about sometimes on Twitter, I'll take a little bit of time to tweet the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, or I'll talk about 13 Reasons Why, which is, a show on Netflix about a girl who dies by suicide. So no, those things don't bring in revenue. They don't necessarily have that income that would be great, but they don't. I would say that they're so much in alignment with my professional values that it really does give me more energy, more motivation to be up early and go to work and do my day job. So it's almost as if it's kind of like giving me the fuel to do the very hard work that I do during the day.
And for me, it's funny. For me, it's a little bit of a similar thing. I, in my day job, lead creative individuals, and I work in marketing, and so I go from kind of driving creative people and trying to get creative individuals, whether they're designers or writers or whatever, to do their best work and be engaged, to kind of these conversations to talk about creativity. And I feel like they do kind of ebb and flow into each other a little bit. So I completely get that.
Yeah.
There's an energizing aspect for me as well. And I feel like it just makes me better at my day job. I mean, I don't know about you, but it makes me a little more well-rounded and keeps, to your point, keeps me energized and keeps me kind of focused on what I love about my job. And inevitably, I always pick up something from each conversation that ends up making me better at what I do during the day.
Well, yeah. So I was about to say it gives us professional growth because we can take maybe a little bit more, we could take risks.
Yes.
We can maybe push ourselves a little bit or pivot a little bit differently and try new things, because if it doesn't work, or if the outcome isn't what we wanted it to be, there's not as big of a loss. And so, I mean, there's certainly an ego attached to it, but it's not like taking risks at your day job or, doing something outside of your role. It gives us a lot of that freedom. And I think it does give us a lot of professional growth that we then take back to our day jobs.
What would you say has been your greatest lesson from all the creative stuff that you've done?
Well, I think I can think of 2 things. One lesson is that I had to reevaluate and redefine creativity. It's apparent from our conversation about my childhood that I thought being creative meant you're an artist, or you design clothes, or you're an interior, just kind of the traditional ways that we define and create constructs around creativity. That I really did need to understand creativity in different ways. That for me, creativity meant cognitive flexibility. It meant coming up with ideas, problem solving, utilizing my analytic side to really turn my profession on its side and go about it a different way. And so I know that I'm not a great artist. I don't sing. I can't paint. I don't. I've let go of the idea that that's who the creative folks are. That's what makes you creative.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt that I can be alongside those folks and find ways to kind of, I guess, carve out a professional pathway that really kind of works in between. And that I think has been really helpful for me. The other thing about lessons is that I definitely believe that maybe failures aren't necessarily or shouldn't necessarily be seen as failures. That I've certainly made some errors. I've certainly taken a turn or did something that maybe I would have liked to do differently.
Mm-hmm.
I can be very specific about something that I don't know how I don't know how I got through it, but I was giving a professional talk. Most folks know about TED Talk,
Mm-hmm.
TEDx talks, and I was doing one of those, and I completely went blank. Like my mind went blank in the middle of the talk. And these are recorded. You don't get a second chance. You don't get a break.
Mm-hmm.
And as much as I rehearsed, as much as I practiced and had my notes, the months before, when you're in that red circle delivering this talk, you don't have those notes in front of you. You have very minimal slides and you don't have a teleprompter. But what you do have are multiple cameras, very bright lights, and a few thousand people watching you.
Right.
And I wouldn't say that I don't necessarily have performance anxiety, but I do often feel a level of a lot of I would say nervousness about just wanting to hit the right points and,
Mm-hmm.
and wanting to tell my story. And the interesting thing is that talk was about imposter syndrome. That talk was about my journey through finding comics, through psychology,
Mm-hmm.
and vice versa. And the villain in that story was imposter syndrome. The idea that I shouldn't even be getting a degree, the idea that I wouldn't be successful, the idea that I was a failure, and ultimately the idea that I shouldn't even be up there giving a TEDx talk.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that ultimately that, those distortions came back to haunt me literally in the middle of my storytelling.
Mm.
And I made some comment. I had a moment of absolute fear and panic, and literally my mind went blank. It's something, it's so curious. That's never happened before. And I was terrified. And all the things that I had talked to my patients about in terms of panic attacks,
Mm-hmm.
the inability to breathe, your heart racing, your hands getting clammy and cold, all of those things started happening. And it was almost a time or dimensional experience where I didn't know how much time had passed. Later, I found out it was just a few seconds. But at the time, it felt like 10, 15 minutes that I was just sort of blankly staring and standing there. And I said something odd. I said something about wanting to take a quick break, which isn't something you do during those talks.
Right.
You don't get that.
Right.
It's not like that's not what happens. I don't know why I said that. I think it just came out, and ultimately, I did recover, and it was really through the help of my now fiance, who knew my talk from beginning to end, and he just kind of gave me a quick cue, and then I was back into it, and I recovered, and it was great. It was a great experience. And so the reason I tell the story, as difficult as it is to think back on it, and even as I talk about it, I start to experience some of those physiological symptoms again. The reason that I bring that up is that I believed that was a failure. I believed for a while that it meant that I was not cut out for public speaking or talking about my work or inspiring other people or energizing other people through performance in this way. And it took me some time to realize that experience was was just one, I guess, one particular stop in the road that led me toward resiliency to help me understand what I needed to overcome. And honestly, as uh, as I thought about that, it did bring me back to superheroes and Batman and the idea that they fall down all the time. Batman's back was broken at one point. Uh, you, you can't expect them to be invulnerable. And we don't learn without these really hard lessons. And the fact that I then needed to speak publicly again and understood that hopefully that wouldn't happen again, but I overcame it. I lived through it. It's now a story I tell. I think that is just kind of another lesson that I carry with me. But I don't see failures as failures anymore. I see them as opportunities for us to become resilient.
What advice do you have for people as they kind of pursue their own creative passions, whatever that might be?
I think that it's easy now to think back on what I could have done or should have done. Like I believe that I'm better suited now to truly understand some of those opportunities that I took or didn't take. So what I often say to others as they're exploring their professional identities and the intersection of their personal identity with their professional identity is that we should definitely be saying yes and no differently. So I would have probably said yes to more things than I did. And the reason for that is maybe I didn't feel competent enough, or I wasn't sure, or whatever the case is. So I would recommend that we say yes more. And then paradoxically, I would say no. Sometimes you just got to say no. And when you're getting an advanced degree, you're constantly being asked to do things. When you're in school, you're constantly wondering, oh, if I just worked on that research project, or if I just joined, asked that advisor if I could collect data, or if I just, entered numbers in this database for hours, maybe they'll recognize me or have me as a co-author. Those things could be true, and those might be opportunities. But I think depending on your discipline and your field, I think that can translate. It's a universal thing. We are eager to please when we're early in our professions, and we say yes to a lot of things, and I think we want that validation. And sometimes it's okay, and we do this a lot more as we get older. It's okay to just say, no, thank you, or, I'm unable to do that right now. Or just, no, I'm never going to do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's funny because that's something I still struggle with. One of the things I tend to get motivated by professionally and personally is a sense of challenge, right? Growth. I get bored really quickly. And so I love to say yes to a lot of things. And every time I hear myself kind of saying no to something, what I conceptualize that as is a missed opportunity.
Yeah.
And so it's something, right, even now, mid-career, achieving a certain level of success, I still consciously have to think through that. Totally get that. Absolutely. So last question. This is kind of a fun one. We'll see if it stumps you or not. How would you define creative success? Oh, I got you. It's quiet.
Yeah. I tend to lean toward asking folks to define things for themselves, or, I tend to want folks to explore things for themselves.
Yes.
That's probably the psychologist in me to not want to impose. I don't want to impose my definition on others.
No.
But for me, I would say it goes back to your behaviors aligning with your authentic professional values. So maybe, and I can speak more specifically to that, my values are around ensuring that I contribute to reducing stigma about mental health. My values are around ensuring that people know there are effective, affordable, accessible interventions for mental health problems and issues. My values are around helping and at least fostering healing if I have those opportunities, because that's my job. So that doesn't mean I have to be a psychologist. I can do this in other ways.
Right.
I can do this through social media. I can do this by calling my friend. I can do this by writing a book about it. So there are multiple ways in which I can really enact those values. And the creative piece is how I decide to align my behaviors with my values. And so sometimes it's not going to be as quote unquote creative because it's how I pay the rent, you know, it's a day-to-day job.
Right.
But it still fits in with those values. And what I tell early career psychologists and other folks who are interested in my field, what I usually tell them is, you know, it looks like I'm doing a lot of different things. It looks like I'm kind of, you know, hustling all the time and I've got this project and that podcast and that thing, but I guarantee you I can draw a common thread. There is a golden thread that aligns everything together, and that makes sense to me. I don't know if it answered your question.
It totally does. There's no right or wrong answer. And what I love about the question, is every time I ask, I get something different.
Yeah.
And I get some really thoughtful answers like yours. You're the first person that's mentioned this kind of idea of a thread that connects everything together. Sometimes you get people talk about moments and they kind of get really visual for me and talk about how they feel, right? The emotional aspect of stuff. There's a whole series of answers kind of around this. And so it's just always fascinating to hear, you know, kind of it gets the heart of motivation, right? And so that's kind of what we're looking for. So yeah, I love that. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Of course. And so I need to ask you, you've probably mentioned this on your show before, but how are you defining creative success?
Yeah, no, thank you. Brian grilled me with a couple questions when we spoke too. I love it. You know, it's funny. So it's about kind of freedom and connectivity for me. And exploration. It really is about kind of doing something that I haven't done before and kind of exploring and improving myself. I'm constantly driven by trying to evolve and be better at what I do and learn and grow. And so the creativity tends to be an expression of that. It's an outcome of that. We talked a little bit earlier about kind of that ability to take in and then kind of reset the balance by creating things. Creativity for me, whether it's been writing or this podcast or my professional work, it's all been about that output of things that I've learned and things that I've taken in and kind of processed. And it's about sharing that in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. And so when I can do that and it resonates with people and I get a feeling a satisfaction out of that, that's completely fulfilling for me. It doesn't matter how many people look at it. It doesn't matter how many people listen to it. And that's what it is for me, but it hasn't always been that. When I was younger, it was very much external. When I was in my mid to late 20s and I moved to New York, I had written a couple plays and I had a book under my belt. And, you know, I moved to New York to write the great American novel and become a novelist because that's what you did.
Right.
And that was a very different time in my life. I was a very different person. You know, I also think it's funny because, right, we're in the 21st century. Mass media is slowly dying off. I don't know if it'll ever die completely, but the internet is the great equalizer. If you have access to a cell phone, you can get on YouTube and make your own show. You and I can essentially create podcasts and have audio shows that we can control and distribute ourselves. Anyone with a computer and internet connection can write a blog and essentially self-publish. I've self-published books through Amazon and, you know, kind of decided to go that route on occasion versus going back and needing an agent. It's this fascinating whole world where you don't need permission anymore. And so for me, it was just this phenomenon of realizing that no one's going to give you permission to do the things you want to do. And there's that satisfaction of just kind of exploring and kind of doing those outputs on your own terms and not needing the approval, like you alluded to earlier, that for me as a more traditional creative individual required that external acknowledgement and validation.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah.
So
that's wonderful.
Yeah. It's a long-winded answer, but it's,
it's great.
It's great. And so we think about Brian's videos and you know, the stuff that he's able to do in the film festivals and the stuff that he's able to kind of explore and do on his own and kind of tap into that. He and I talked about that as well. I think there's all these opportunities that are out there, and it's just a matter of people taking advantage of them and learning how to harness them. Totally.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So that said, now's the opportunity where we get to let you talk about what you do, where people can find you, put your plugs in for your shows. I think most people probably know who you are if they're listening to this episode, but why don't you go ahead and kind of run through your digital presence here for everybody in case they're not familiar with your stuff.
Well, if folks are listening to this podcast, then maybe they like podcasts, and I do 2 of them. So
imagine that.
You mentioned the Arkham Sessions.
Yep.
That's the podcast all about psychology and Batman. It's so much fun. You've now had both co-hosts on your show.
Yes.
So that is available on iTunes, Stitcher, and other places where you might get your dose of podcasts. You can find us on Twitter at Arkham Sessions. We're also on Instagram at Arkham Sessions. My other podcast is all about Star Wars. So I'm absolutely lucky to be able to talk on a routine basis about Batman and Star Wars, which, I would say are 2 of my favorite fandoms. And that podcast is called Lattes with Leia. Mm-hmm. And my co-host Amy Ratcliffe and myself basically talk about all we love about Star Wars, and our elevator pitch or our description of it is basically just 2 fangirls talking about Star Wars like you would if you're just meeting someone for coffee, and just what are you into today? What do you think about the Han Solo movie? What are those awesome leggings that have later on them, and where did you get them? So those are the kinds of conversations.
That's awesome.
Absolutely. And so if folks just want to interact, I'm on Twitter at Arkham Asylum Doc, and my website is underthemaskonline.com.
Oh, look, you've done that so many times it rolled right off. Total pro. I love it. I love it.
Thank you.
So, Drea, this was wonderful. Thank you for making time. We ran a little bit over.
Okay.
Sorry about the technology problems. We'll address that in post, as they say. It's not a problem. But thank you. Thank you for being so candid. Thank you for taking time. You are the first person, as we alluded to, that I've interviewed that actually is canon in the comic book world. I love that. You and Brian are also the first kind of other podcasters that I've interviewed. So best of luck with everything. But thank you again. I've really greatly enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure to chat.
All right, folks, there you have it. Thanks to Drea for doing the interview. Folks, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Now, if you like the episode, shoot me an email and let me know. In fact, to show my appreciation, I'll send you a few stickers and buttons as my way of saying thanks. Just remember to include your mailing address in your email to me. You can reach me at headheartandhustle@gmail.com or through our website. You can also get email updates from us, which are fairly inconsistent, I'll admit, depending on how busy my life gets. Visit headheartandhustle.com/newsletter to sign up for those. Remember that you can also find us on the web at headheartandhustle.com, as well as multiple social media platforms, including Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Google+. Our logo was created by Meg Shear, so if you're really digging that, you can find her other work on Society6. Just look for Meg's stuff. Now, the music you hear each episode was written and performed by my good friends Starch to Sugar. You can find them at starchtossugar.com or through Facebook. Lastly, if you're interested in being interviewed for a future episode of the podcast, you can contact me at headheartandhustle@gmail.com. As always, I want to thank you for listening. Now, go create something.